Hey guys, tonight we're heading to a place where the nights are longer than your last relationship, and the sheep might not just be sheep. Imagine a lonely Icelandic hillside in the 1600s, freezing wind howling through lava fields. You're only neighbors, a few scattered farmers, a dozen ancient sagas, and maybe, just maybe, a translucent you staring at you through the fog. No, it's not a glitch in the Matrix. It's just Iceland doing Iceland. Tonight, you're going to sleep in a turf house with a sod roof and a supernatural livestock problem. Your candle's burning low, the shutters are rattling, and someone swears they just saw one moving in the churchyard. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Always love to see who's still awake. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with wind. Always wind. It sneaks through the gaps in your turf walls, dragging with it the smell of salt and sheep and ancient things that don't quite have names anymore. You're bundled under layers of rough wool and dried moss, lying on a lumpy straw mattress that smells faintly of old milk. The fire has burned down to glowing coals. Outside, it's the kind of cold that makes even ghosts wear scarves. You're in Iceland, sometime in the 1660s, and you found shelter in a croft carved halfway into a hillside. Everything's low and close, the ceiling, the doorframe, even the people's voices. It's like the whole island is whispering, and every whisper ends in a sheep bleating somewhere just out of sight. They're everywhere here. Sheep are wealth, warmth, food, and fabric. They will line your mittens, fills your bedding, and probably clogs your lungs with lanolin while you sleep. But lately, folks are less concerned with shearing the man, more with what happens when they start showing up, after they've already been butchered. You've heard things. Everyone has. Some of the stories are told half joking, like when a farmer says his mutton stew tasted too fresh. Others come with nervous looks toward the hills and an urgent reminder to keep your shutters bolted. The thing about 17th century Iceland is that it's both incredibly grounded and deeply weird. The people here are practical to the point of brutal, yet they still believe in a way that's bone deep in things like ghosts, trolls, and invisible sheep. You get the feeling they'd rather face a famine than a talking ram, and famines not a rare occurrence. The climate's rough, crops are stubborn, livestock is precious. So when something happens to a herd, especially something unnatural, it rattles more than just the economy. It messes with the rhythm of life itself. You sit at the supper bench with your host family, slurping dried fish stew as they murmur about that old ewe near the glacier. One claims it's been seen 3 winters in a row, always limping on the same leg. But here's the thing, it died 6 winters ago. They remember because it froze upright in a snowdrift, and the youngest boy tried to ride it like a sled. Historians still argue whether these ghost sheep were just a coping mechanism for grief, hallucinations brought on by cold and starvation, or clever metaphors sewn into folklore by bored shepherds. But to the people living it, the explanation is much simpler. Some sheep just don't know when to stay dead. You step outside after dinner, just for a moment. The sky is low and heavy with stars, like it might tip and spill them. The wind grabs your cloak, and somewhere on the far slope, silhouetted against the dark, something moves just for a second. It's too far to be sure, but it had 4 legs, and it watched you back inside. You wrap yourself in another scratchy blanket and lie down next to the hearth. You stare at the smoky rafters and try to think of anything but hooves. The fire flickers. You hear a far-off B-L-E-A-T. It's probably just the wind, or it ISN single quotes T. Either way, it's bedtime in Iceland. You wake up with a jolt. Something just scuffed across the packed earth floor. Not loudly, not fast, just enough to make your brain scream. Not wind. You hold your breath, eyes wide in the dark, listening. There it is again, scrape, scrape. But by the time you sit up, it's gone. Just the fire's faint glow and the scent of damp wool. Your host doesn't stir. He's rolled in his own cocoon of sheepskin like a large, snoring cigar. The sheepdog lifts its head briefly, grunts, then drops it back down. If they aren't panicking, you tell yourself, maybe you shouldn't either. Still, you wedge a wooden stool against the door, just in case, outside. The wind gnaws at the eaves like it's trying to remember the shape of the roof, the walls. Creak in reply, and you lie back down, wondering why anyone would choose to live here. The answer, of course, is sheep. Icelanders in the 1600s didn't exactly have a lot of economic options. Sheep provided everything from food and clothing to candles and eaving glue. Entire families built their survival around wool. So it's not surprising that the animals occupied a place of honor and fear in the Icelandic imagination. You soon discover that Icelandic turf farms are like little green boats, beached on a sea of black lava. Each croft consists of low buildings, stitched together with grass, rock, and whatever driftwood didn't get stolen. The interiors are smoky, warm, and absolutely filled with sheep, sometimes literally. In colder months, lambs often slept indoors alongside the family woolly hot water bottles that occasionally bleated. In their sleep by day, shepherds trudged out with long crooks and even longer beards, guiding their flocks across icy rivers and over mossy ridges. By night, they came home usually, but not always, and that's where the stories begin. One tale tells of a shepherd who vanished during a blizzard, only to return a week later silent, wide-eyed and reeking of wet wool. He never spoke again, just rocked in his chair and muttered things that sounded an awful lot like sheep names. Some say he was lost in a snow cave. Others insist he'd been herding something else entirely. Sheep were also known to act strangely. Occasionally, flocks would bolt for no reason, eyes wide with terror, bleating toward nothing. That was often followed by the sudden disappearance of a ewe or a human. The Icelanders had a word for such moments, skuggafellig, meaning shadow company. The feeling that something unseen was watching, herding, waiting, you help out with. Morning chores, fumbling through the frost with a bucket of feed and a strong suspicion that the sheep are judging you, which they are. All 12 of them stare as one, like a woolly jury. Then, without warning, they all turn to look toward the same spot on the ridge. Nothing's there. Your host's daughter, 8 years old and terrifyingly blunt, nods and says, "That's where the ghost sheep live." You laugh. She doesn't. Later, you sit in the smokehouse with an old woman who cards wool while chewing dried fish and listing, in alphabetical order, the names of sheep that have come back from the dead. There are at least 14. One, she claims, appeared inside her parlor last winter and calmly stepped into the fireplace, leaving behind only a hoofprint and the smell of scorched hay. Historians still argue whether these stories were metaphorical stand-ins for grief, loss, or the uncanny way sheep sometimes do return after being presumed dead, or whether they represent a genuine strand of Icelandic belief in the porous boundary between the living and the not quite dead. The line between folklore and farming was as thin as a strand of spun wool. As night falls again, you help secure the sheep, fold a circle of low stone walls and creaking wooden gates. One ewe lingers near the edge, reluctant to enter. You nudge it gently with your foot. It turns to look at you. No pupils, just clouded white eyes like polished milk glass. Then it walks inside. You don't mention that part. Inside, you sip a mixture of sky and sour whey, which tastes like curdled regret. But it's warm, and that's good enough. Outside, snow begins to fall, swirling in slow, silent spirals. The fire pops. The sheepdog sighs. You're tucked into bed again, though you wedge the stool against the door a little more firmly. Tonight, just in case, the shadows move differently when the moon's behind the clouds, and you swear you hear breathing slow, heavy, animal-like somewhere in the turf above you. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's the sheep. Or maybe it's something that wears the shape of a sheep because it knows how much you depend on them. In Iceland, that's the ultimate camouflage. You wait before dawn, which isn't difficult when the sun takes its sweet time getting up. Winter here drags the sky down like a heavy woolen curtain, and a darkness lingers long past breakfast. Not that you're having breakfast. Not until you help find the missing sheep. Your host bursts in from the fold, cheeks red with cold and concern. One ewe is gone, just gone. No signs of struggle, no broken fences, no scattered wool. Just a perfect little gap where it had been huddled. With the rest last night. That's how it always starts. Outside, the snow crunches under your boots like old parchment. You and 2 others make a slow loop around the croft, calling out names like St. Freya and la as if the sheep might politely respond from behind. A rock. It's more ritual than rescue. You crest a rise and stop. Down below. The hillside is crisscrossed with hoofprints due many, too deep for one ewe, and they don't lead anywhere. They spiral, a perfect, slow spiral in the snow then, vanish completely. The girl next to you makes the sign of the Hammer's protection and says nothing. Back at the croft, the mood is taut. Someone mutters that the sheep was taken by the night herd, and everyone avoids eye contact. You get the sense this isn't the first time, or even the 10th. That's when you start to hear the older tales. The farmers speak softly, voices barely, rising above the wind hissing around the door frame. They speak of ghost sheepdogs, strange beasts made of fog, and fleece that appear during winter's darkest nights. They say these apparitions are born not of nature, but of grief, sin, or revenge. And once they find you, they don't just haunt, they follow. One tale, half whispered by a shepherd with frost-bitten fingers, tells of a flock that vanished in a snowstorm only to reappear months later in a neighboring field, silent and motionless. When the new farmer tried to shear one, his hand passed right through. The next day, his own sheep were gone. You start to see why sleep is a fragile thing here. It's not just the weather, or the wolves, or the creaking of ancient timber. It's the slow realization that some shapes in the dark don't behave the way animals should. That sometimes a woolly head turns to slowly, or not at all. Historians still argue whether these stories were born from isolation, mass hallucination, or genuine sightings of some rare weather phenomenon like ball lightning or frost mirages. But in the world of 17th century Iceland, none of that matters. If the sheep came back wrong, they came back cursed. You spend the day indoors, spinning wool alongside the matron of the house, whose fingers move like quicksilver. She talks us. She works, recalling the winter when her cousin saw a flock grazing upside down, hooves planted to the sky, bellies to the earth. They weren't sheep, she murmurs. They were just wearing sheep. Outside, the light fades early. The hearth blaze is high tonight, extra driftwood, just in case. As shadows stretch across the packed earth floor, someone tells the tale of the glowing ram of a Koreri, whose horns gave off pale blue light. Supposedly it brought luck to those who ignored it and nightmares to those who stared too long. You wonder how many of these stories began as jokes or dares or half-truths, told by lonely shepherds desperate for company. But then again, jokes don't usually end with frostbite and permanent twitching. Sleep comes reluctantly tonight. The air feels heavier. Even the dog won't settle, pacing between door and hearth, ears twitching, just as you begin to drift. You hear it. The faintest bleat from outside. Not frightened, not calling, just present. You pull the blanket tighter, reminding yourself that you helped lock the sheepfold yourself, that the missing you was never found. That spirals in snow don't mean anything, but your gut knows better, because it's winter in Iceland, and the sheep are never just sheep. Morning arrives more like a suggestion than a fact, just a faint lightening of the gloom. Beyond the thick window pane, coated with frost and breath and superstition, you sit on the edge of your straw pallet, rubbing your eyes, wondering if it was all a dream, the vanishing you, the spiral prints, the phantom bleat. Then you notice your boots. They're wet, not soaked, but damp in that very specific way that says you stepped in snow. You stare at them for a long time, trying to remember if you left them too close to the door. Trying to remember if you sleepwalker that you aren't went outside. The house is quiet, except for the fire crackling and the occasional creak of timber overhead. Someone upstairs is sweeping. The dog eyes your boots too, ears twitching, and lets out a low, thoughtful whine. You whisper a promise to not look out the window. You fail immediately. It's snowing again, heavily, but just visible between gusts. Up on the hill are shapes. They don't move, not exactly, but your brain insists they're watching. Later that day, your host takes you into the next valley to help barter for grain. It's a bleak trudge through knee-deep snow, past a frozen creek where even the ravens are silent. The other farm is larger, with a sheepfold surrounded by thick ashwood posts carved with runes. The man who greets you is older, grizzled, and has a face like the bark of a tree. He insists on pouring hot ale before trade, and you're too polite to refuse even though it tastes like socks. His wife, a stern-eyed woman with a voice like flint, sits beside the hearth spinning yarn and telling stories you wish you could unhear. There was a lamb, she says, born with its eyes sealed shut, wouldn't open them, no matter what we did. It was healthy, strong, but it didn't bleat. Not once. We kept it, thinking it was a sign. She stopped spinning for a moment. It wasn't. Turns out, they buried that lamb on the third day after it tried to walk into the hearth fire. But it returned the next spring twice as large and covered in dirt. Standing motionless in the field until sunset, you sip the ale and try to smile. Historians still argue whether stories like this reflect an early form of livestock disease folklore perhaps, a psychological coping strategy for unexplained animal behavior. But here in the firelight, surrounded by tools older than most countries, those explanations feel about as useful as a sieve in a snowstorm. You help load 2 sacks of barley onto a sled, and your host insists on taking a longer route home, even though it means crossing frozen streams in near darkness. He mumbles that the direct way passes through her field and won't elaborate. Back at the croft, dinner is boiled root stew with bits of mutton so old you suspect it might qualify as an antique. The young daughter eats silently, occasionally peeking at the hearth like she's expecting someone or something. That night, as everyone settles in, you ask casually about ghost sheep. The room stills. Your host doesn't speak. His wife mutters something about foolish curiosity. But the old uncle, who's mostly been chewing on a pipe stem all week, leans in. He tells you of the sheep that bleat without mouths, of the ones who walk with broken legs that never seem to heal, of the ghost ram said to guard a buried treasure somewhere near Hekla, one of Iceland's most infamous volcanoes. Anyone who follows it reportedly finds riches or goes missing, usually both. He finishes with a nod as if that explains everything. You nod too because frankly you're afraid not to. Sleep that night is a distant, twitching thing. You lie awake for what feels like hours, heart pounding every time the wind changes pitch. Then, softly, almost kindly, you hear it, the sound of hooves walking across the roof. Slow, steady, deliberate. 1, 2, pause, 3, 4. Silence. You don't move. You barely breathe. You picture the roof, turf, wooden slats, a thin barrier between you and whatever is pacing up there like it owns the place. The dog growls but doesn't bark. The fire sputters, casting uneasy shadows. Then, very clearly, the bleating begins. It's not frantic, not even particularly loud, but it's wrong. Hollow, like someone trying to remember how a sheep is supposed to sound. You lie there until it stops. It eventually always stops. But that's the worst part, the stopping. Morning in Iceland doesn't come with sunshine, it arrives with resignation. The sky stays the color of old dishwater, and the wind drags across the landscape like it forgot something last night and came back to get it. You step outside, your breath instantly snatched away, and scan the roof. No hoof prints, no disturbed turf, no sign that anything walked overhead in the dark. But you know what you heard. Back inside, you poke at your breakfast of cold oat cakes and sour whey, while the old uncle cheerfully carves sheep bones into playing pieces. He whistles through missing teeth, tapping the bone chips in strange rhythms. He says it keeps the spirits distracted. Later that day, you're sent to the next croft with a basket of cured meat and a reminder to go the long way. You go the long way. The neighbors are a superstitious bunch-hand that's saying something in a place where people leave food out for elves. Their walls are covered in carved symbols, some runic, some just deep gouges from panicked fingers. A little boy answers the door and stares at you without blinking. She's in the barn, he says. Before you can even explain your presence, She says the ghost sheep are coming back. Inside the barn, the smell hits first. Wet hay, sheep dung, and something sharper burned milk. You find her crouched by a pile of wool, muttering to herself, tearing strips of cloth and tying them around her wrists. She's a widow named Goofinna, and everyone says she's either cursed or blessed. It depends which part of the valley you're asking. A few years back, her neighbor accused her of hexing his sheep after 2 lambs were born with twisted spines. She swore innocence, of course, but the damage was done. The sheep started acting strangely. They stopped eating. One charged at a shadow. Another vanished entirely, only to return days later bleeding from its ears. Eventually, someone found a dead ewe with its fleece burned in a perfect circle and a rock in its mouth. The villagers marched up to Goofinna's croft with torches traditional, very pitchfork chic, but the priest intervened. He declared that she was not a witch, just troubled by grief and the weather. Still, the accusation stuck. People avoided her, except for the occasional brave soul who came for cures. She made poultices from moss and whispered to their sick animals. Some got better, some didn't. She never charged. You sit with her now in the barn, watching her sort bits of wool into separate piles, clean, tainted, forgotten. She tells you about the sheep she once loved, a runt she raised from birth. The only thing that listened to her after her husband drowned. It died 2 winters ago, she says. Then, last spring, it came back. I heard it in the field, she says softly, eyes not quite focusing. It was humming. You try not to react, but she sees it. Ghosts don't always look like people. She adds, sometimes they come in familiar shapes. It's easier that way. Historians still argue whether women like Goofinna were misunderstood herbalists, victims of patriarchal paranoia, or simply community scapegoats. Some claim the ghost sheep were actually signs of ergot poisoning, hallucinogenic fungus on stored grain and hay. Others think it was isolation and grief, turning the brain inward like a sheepfold of the mind. Either way, you can't shake the image of that humming lamb. When you return to your croft, the wind is worse. It whips the snow sideways, hiding every trail behind a wall of white. You slam the door shut behind you and stomp your boots dry, only to realize there's a patch of wool stuck to the toe. Coarse, charred at the edges. No one saw you leave with wool. That night, the stories bubble. Back up over dinner. Someone mentions the legend of the 3-eyed ram that could see into men's dreams. Another tells of a phantom ewe that led a priest into a bog and was never seen again. Then there's the tale of the sheep that walked backwards into the sea, leaving no prints behind, only a trail of steam. You listen in silence, letting the fire warm your hands. But part of you is still out there in the barn with Goofinna, surrounded by the scent of old fleece and secrets. You don't sleep much that night. Who could? The wind has started to carry voices, not words. Not songs. Just a low, insistent bleating. Long. Drawn out. Wrong. By the next morning, everyone's acting normal, which is never a good sign in a place where the normal includes occasional livestock apparitions and disappearing neighbors. The old uncle hums tunelessly. Your host sharpens a knife that's already sharp. The sheepdog won't go near the door. There's tension in the air. A brittle stillness that wraps around the croft like an invisible fence. You overhear hushed talk of a letter. A bishop is coming, which, in theory, should be comforting. Except in 17th century Iceland, bishops aren't just sermon readers. They're moral enforcers, relic hunters, and on occasion ghost botherers. Especially when livestock starts acting like extras from a nightmare. A bishop showing up isn't so much a rescue as a last resort. When he arrives, he's not what you expect. Tall, clean-shaven, draped in fine wool dyed clerical black. His boots are polished. His gloves are stitched with silver thread. He smells like cloves and authority. And he's brought a book that looks older than Iceland itself. You help carry his belongings into the croft. Among the practical items, candles. Paper, spare vestments is a strange bundle wrapped in sealskin. Heavy, cold. You're told not to ask about it. So, naturally, your brain builds 16 theories before lunch. The bishop doesn't waste time. He asks for witnesses, records. Rumors. You notice he doesn't write anything down. He just listens, nods, and asks questions like, "Did the sheep make eye contact?" Or "Was the wool warm that afternoon?" He leads you and 3 others to a sheepfold built halfway into a hillside, abandoned after a bad spring 3 years ago. No one's used it since the incident. You are not told what the incident was, just that it involved screaming and an unusual smell. You reach the fold by mid-afternoon. The sky is a sheet of grey wool, pressing low, and the cold bites. Harder here. As you cross the threshold, the bishop opens his sealskin bundle. Inside, a silver aspergillum, a flask of holy water, and a small cross made of volcanic glass. You're not religious, but that last one makes you nervous. He walks the perimeter slowly, sprinkling water, muttering Latin phrases that sound like they're apologizing in advance. At the center of the fold, he stops. There's something in the hay. You all see it. A lump, fleece-like, slightly steaming. The bishop approaches. You hold your breath. He reaches down, parts the straw and recoils. It's a dead ewe, perfectly preserved despite the freezing cold, with no rot, no smell, and no eyes. Just blank sockets filled with packed snow. He says nothing, just draws the glass cross across its body and begins a chant that seems far too quiet for how loud the wind suddenly becomes. Historians still argue whether bishops like him believed the law or simply played the role expected of them. Some were deeply devout, others more like bureaucratic exorcists, more concerned with public peace than spiritual warfare. But this bishop, he looks afraid, which, frankly, doesn't help your nerves. He finishes his rites, covers the ewe again, and declares the fold unfit for earthly use. You walk back in silence. That night, the bishop dines with your hosts. The mood is strained. No one talks about what was seen, only about the weather, trade, and how the new baby lambs will be here soon. No one mentions that lambing season starts in spring. It's January. The bishop excuses himself early and retreats to his room. You follow soon after, though sleep does not come easily. Your dreams are full of straw, of black glass, of eyeless animals that don't blink. Around midnight, the dog begins to growl, then whimper, then hide under the bench. You lie still. The fire is nearly out. There's no wind tonight, just a deep, unnatural hush. And then a thud. On the roof. Then another, slower, heavier. You tell yourself it could be snow sliding, or ice melting, or imagination, until the bleating starts, not above, but inside the walls. Low, ragged, like something trying to sound normal. You sit up, heart in your throat, and hear it clearly. Bleat, pause, scrape, scrape. Something is moving inside the turf. You light a candle with shaking hands. The flame flickers wildly, though the air is still. You don't wake the others. What would you say? Sorry to disturb, but I think one of the sheep has returned from the underworld and is redecorating the insulation. You lie back down. Candle still burning, watching the wall. Eventually, it goes quiet. Eventually, you sleep. Eventually, the bishop leaves at dawn, not in a rush exactly, but with the kind of brisk professionalism reserved for people who don't plan to return. He gives your host a brief nod, declines breakfast, and steps into the snow without looking back. The dog refuses to follow him. You watch from the doorway as his black coat disappears into the fog, the silver thread on his gloves the last thing to vanish. And then he's gone, just like the ewe in the sheepfold, just like the sound in the wall. The croft settles into a slow, uneasy rhythm again. The ghost sheep haven't returned, at least not visibly. But there's an extra quiet now, like the house is holding its breath. Someone spills milk, and it splashes into the shape of a hoof. No one laughs. You try to distract yourself with chores. It's wool combing day. You sit with the matron and the older daughter in a smoke-dark room thick with lanolin and silence. Your fingers ache. The wool snags on unseen splinters. Your mind wanders. That's when you see it. Carved into the side of the wooden comb, barely visible under years of use, is a strange symbol. A rune. or at least something trying very hard to be won. It's shaped like a sheep's head. If the sheep had 3 eyes, you blink and trace your finger over it. The matron catches your hand and gently moves it away. Best not touch that, she says. It's just old superstition, which, as you've learned here, means it's probably dangerous. Turns out these wool cones aren't just for smoothing. Fleece. Some of them were carved with protective runes, symbols meant to keep the wool from tangling. Sure, but also to ward off whatever might follow it into the house. Because when ghost sheep visit, they don't knock. There's one rune called Thiarboni, Sheep Bane, a rough diamond shape with hooked legs, said to banish restless flocks from beyond. Supposedly invented by a blind shepherd who dreamed it during a fever. Some say it works. Others say it just angers them. Historians still argue whether these rune practices were truly magical, or just early agricultural psychology, a way to give shepherds a sense of control over a brutal and unpredictable world. But either way, the symbols are real, and you're holding one now. The daughter leans over and whispers that there are more runes hidden under the sheepfold gates. She's not supposed to know. Her father thinks such things invite trouble. But she's seen the way the sheep act when they pass over them, nervous, skittish, like they're stepping on something alive. That evening, the air turns strangely warm for winter. The snow begins to melt, puddling around the house. The sheep shuffle uneasily in the fold, hooves clicking on the wet stones. You hear one bleat short and sharp hand suddenly silence. You step outside. There, in the muddy patch between the shed and the woodshed, is a trail. Not prints exactly, more like impressions. Damp spots where no one has walked. Hoof-shaped, but too large, too deep. They end at the side of the house, near the wall that kept whispering. You go inside. You don't tell anyone. Dinner is turnip mash and boiled fish. The daughter hums an off-key lullaby as she helps clean the bowls. The old uncle won't stop sharpening a stick. You think it's for soup. You hope it's for soup. Later, as the fire dies down, you retrieve the comb with the carved rune. You stare at it in the dim light. It's oddly comforting in the way that only primitive, desperate magic can be. You place it near the wall, just in case. That night, the wind rises again, but the house feels quieter, like something's moved further away. You sleep deeply for the first time in days, until a single sound wakes you: a not from outside, from beneath your bed. You don't move. The sound repeats, slightly more distorted this time, like a recording, played backwards. Then it stops. You lie awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence gather round you like fleece. You don't mention the underbed bleating, not because you're ashamed or afraid of ridicule at this point. Ghost sheep are a recurring theme, like the cold or salted fish, but because no one else is talking either. There's a quiet agreement, now unspoken but absolute. Whatever's happening, it's real, and the less said, the better. Besides, it's midwinter madness season. That's what the locals call this strange, heavy stretch of January. The sun barely shows its face, everyone's slightly sleep-deprived, and reality itself feels as slippery as a frozen stream. It's the time of year when old legends crawl back out of memory and start knocking at your door, which is why you're sent on an errand. Not for supplies, but for a story. The family wants you to visit someone, a man who lives alone on the edge of the lava field, where the land buckles and steams and smells faintly of sulfur and boiled wool. His name is John, though everyone calls him the bone herder. You trudge for nearly 2 hours through knee-deep snow, the landscape shifting from bleak farmland to black rock spiked with ice. Steam vents hiss softly around you like dragons clearing their throats. There are no birds, just the occasional echo of your own boots and the sense that you are being watched. When you arrive at Jan's hut, it's not what you expect. The walls are made of stone and whalebone. The door is low and carved with dozens of animal skulls. A lamb's jaw hangs above the frame like a wind chime. He answers your knock instantly, as if he were already standing there. His beard is grey and matted, and his eyes are pale and uneven, one sharp and clear, the other clouded like skim milk. You explain why you've come. He nods once, turns, and leaves the door open. Inside, it's dark, warm, and cluttered with bones. Not human, you think, but not just sheep either. Bird bones, fish skeletons. The skull of something long-snouted and worrying. There's a pile of fleece in the corner. Uncarded, stained, moving slightly. You sit, and John begins to talk. He says there are sheep born of grief. Not the kind you raise, but the kind you remember to heart. If you love a creature too much or mourn it too loudly, it can return, he says. Not the same, not even close, but close enough to fool the eye, to step through the cracks, to wear the old skin and walk the old fields. One winter, he lost his entire flock to a rock slide. All but one a lamb with a bad leg he'd named Hrafen. The lamb wouldn't stop crying, he says, wouldn't stop trying to find the others. So he buried the bones near the hot springs, wrapped in their own wool, and carved runes over the graves. Then, one night, he heard them walking. Not just Hrafen, all of them. Hooves on stone, breaths in the dark, and then came the smell. Burnt fleece, and Salt Dot he found footprints in the ash the next morning. Hoof-shaped, but backward. That spring, a new flock appeared in the hills identical to his old one. Same markings, same temperaments, even Hrafen still limping. But they wouldn't let him touch them, wouldn't let anyone touch them. They just stood, watching Dot until one day they were gone. Historians still argue whether the bone herder's story is just an elaborate coping mechanism, a folk tale told too often by a man who spent too many winters alone. Some say it's an oral metaphor for Iceland's cycles of loss. Others think he's just messing with you, but as he speaks, you notice his hands never stop moving. He's carving bones into tiny sheep figurines, each one with hollow eyes. You thank him and leave before dark. The walk home is worse. The wind cuts sideways. The sky turns purple and white. The path vanishes. You find yourself retracing your own footsteps, only to discover they'd been joined by others. Hoof prints, fresh. You walk faster. By the time you reach the croft, your fingers are stiff and your nerves are frayed. No one asks what he told you. You just nod, drop your coat by the fire, and eat whatever is hot and edible. That night, you dream of sheep again. But this time, they are not sheep. They have no wool, no eyes, just long, grey bodies shaped like the idea of a sheep moving in unison, always forward. Toward you, when you wake, there's a bone figurine on your windowsill, one you didn't bring back. You don't scream, mostly because screaming doesn't work here, it just echoes, then dies in the rafters. You stare at the bone figurine instead, a small sheep, curled as if lying down, with strange gouges where the eyes should be. Hollow. Smooth. It wasn't here last night. You're sure of it, and even if it were, you definitely didn't carry it home in your coat. So, unless it walked on its own tiny legs through a blizzard and climbed a windowsill, someone or something put it there. You bring it to breakfast like it's a bad omen served with porridge. The family goes still. Your host takes it gently, like he's handing a dead bird, and sets it in the center of the table. No one touches it again. The old uncle mutters, he's marked now, and no one disagrees. You are he? Marked by what, though? The bone herder? The ghost sheep? The stories themselves? It's hard to tell. Iceland has a way of blurring the line between cause and consequence. You listen to the wind and wonder whether it's too late to unhear things. That afternoon, you head to the communal spring, a naturally heated pool half surrounded by stones, used by several families for washing and very occasional bathing. The steam coils into the air like a ghost politely excusing itself. You soak with two neighbors, both women, both older than the mountains. One of them, Rin, eyes your face and says, "You've seen the bone sheep, haven't you?" You nod. Too tired to pretend otherwise, she sighs and closes her eyes. You'll dream harder now. Be ready. The other woman, Steinund, says her brother once saw a sheep with no mouth. It just stared. 3 days later, he forgot how to speak, never got it back. They tell you that Iceland is held together by stories. The land, the language, Even the silence, it's all stitched with belief, not belief like church pews and prayers. Deeper, older, practical. Because when the sun barely rises and your sheep start acting like shadows, you don't ask why. You just act. Burn herbs, nail runes to your barn, sleep facing north. Historians still argue whether this kind of thinking was born of necessity, ancient psychology, shaped by relentless winters and constant death, or if it's simply a survival tactic dressed up in poetry. But either way, these people aren't guessing, they're remembering. You return to the croft smelling faintly of sulphur and moss. The bone sheep still sits on the table, exactly where it was. No one's moved it. No one dares. The next day, you hear about a sheep found dead in the snow. Its body was untouched. No signs of struggle. Just lying there, belly up, legs curled inward. Frozen except its fleece had been removed. Perfectly shorn. No clippers, no blood. Like it had simply let go of its wool. You volunteer to go see it. Probably not your smartest moment. The croft that found the sheep is a few miles south, perched on a narrow ledge over a river gorge. It's the kind of place you'd never notice until it was gone. The farmer who greets you is gaunt, pale, and smells like sour smoke. He leads you to the barn without speaking, and there it is. The sheep is real, dead and naked. Its skin is intact, no cuts, no flaps, just smooth, pale hide. Its wool lies beside it in a perfect sheet, like a costume waiting to be worn. You don't touch it. You don't speak. Because then you notice the marks in the hay. HOOFPRINTS. For dash-legged. But not the sheep's. To deep. To big. You step back. The farmer closes the barn door slowly, like he's sealing in a storm. That night, your dreams change. You're standing in the field behind the croft, watching the sheep graze. But they're wrong. Their shadows stretch too far. Their eyes don't blink. One of them lifts its head and its mouth opens sideways. You wake covered in sweat, clutching your blanket like a lifeline. The bone sheep is gone. You never hear it leave. You spend the morning looking for the bone sheep, not because you expect to find it, but because not looking feels worse. You check the windowsill, the table, even the woodshed, which smells like old tools and something damp that might once have been bread. Nothing. When you finally mention it, your host just nods. Not surprised, not concerned, just resigned. They don't stay where you put them, he says. The old uncle grins without humor. They find their own shelf. You do not ask what happens when the shelf is you. The daughter draws you aside. Later, clutching a wool-wrapped bundle, she unwraps it slowly. Another sheep carving. Smaller. Wood, not bone. Less precise. Eyes intact this time. She carved it, she says, after her dreams started getting echo. Why? You don't know what that means, and she won't elaborate. But she gives you the figure anyway. Says it's for balance. To confuse the watchers, you accept it, because declining gifts from children who talk like eldritch archivists is a bad idea in any folklore system. That afternoon, you help mend a broken section of fence. The wind is sharp and fast, and you have to shout to be heard. Your host mentions offhandedly that some sheep have started sleeping apart from the flock. Not unusual, he says, when they've been marked. You ask what marked means. He just points at the hill behind the croft. There, in the snow, are 4 distinct hoofprints, deep, melted slightly around the edges. But they don't lead anywhere, just a neat square, a kind of symbol. You don't step any closer. That night, a storm rolls in. Snow hammers the roof, wind howls down the chimney, and the walls groan under the pressure of old construction and older fears. The sheep are restless, bleating sporadically, like they're calling for something they can't see. You check the barn before bed, lantern in hand. The air is thick with breath and hay. All the animals are present, all accounted for, except one is facing the wrong way. A ram, your host's pride, stands with its head pressed against the far wall, not moving, not reacting, just standing. You wave your hand. Nothing. Tap the horn. No response. Then it lets out a long, low exhale, a sound that does not belong to a sheep, deep, hollow, Wet. You back away slowly, muttering that you'll check on him in the morning. You don't. You suggest your host does. He doesn't either. Historians still argue whether strange livestock behavior in historical records reflected actual conditions, disease, malnutrition, harsh climate, or whether people truly believed their sheep could be haunted, bewitched, or worse. Iceland's records blur the line. They list diseases, yes, but also signs, behavior that seems out of place, animals that refused to cast shadows. The old texts don't always distinguish between the physical and the supernatural. A sheep with second breath, for instance, could mean pneumonia, or it could mean that it had learned to speak after death. You go to bed that night holding the wooden sheep in one hand, like a charm or a weapon. The walls groan. The wind claws at the thatch. At some point, just before sleep claims you, you hear a whisper, not words. Not human, but unmistakably coming from the small wooden carving beside your head. You throw it across the room. It hits the wall with a thunk, and then something else hits the floor beside it, a single hoofprint, melted clean through the frost on the inside of the window. You don't sleep the rest of the night. You just wait for the bleating. By morning, the frost inside the window has reformed, but not evenly. There's a hole, perfectly round, exactly where the hoofprint had been, as if something had pressed against the glass from within and then politely left. You don't mention it. You're learning. Instead, you help with breakfast like nothing is wrong. You stir the porridge. You chop the dried fish. You keep one eye on the door, because you're not entirely sure it will stay closed if whatever visited in the night decides it wants back in. The old uncle seems unusually cheerful today. He sharpens a spoon, not uses a sharpened spoon sharpens. 1. You ask why. Some sheep don't like steel, he says. Others don't like knowing you're ready. You make a mental note to sleep with cutlery. Later that morning, a messenger arrives on horseback, wrapped in furs and covered in snow like a walking avalanche. He doesn't dismount, just hands your host a letter, nods once, and rides off toward the fog without a word. The letter is sealed in black wax, the bishop's seal. Everyone leans in, but no one touches it. It sits on the table like it might bite. Finally, your host opens it, brow furrowing as he reads aloud. It's an instruction, a warning, a date. There will be a burning. Next full moon, a cleansing. The bishop will return with a delegation. They're coming to remove the influence, whatever that means. You notice no one looks relieved, least of all your host. That night, the daughter draws runes on the window panes with sheep's milk and charcoal. She tells you they're from her grandmother, ones they used back when the sheep started singing. You ask if there was a joke. She doesn't blink. Dinner is quiet, except for the fire and the occasional clack of bone on bone. Someone's started making more carvings. The table now has a small herd. You check your own pockets, just in case. There's nothing inside except a bit of wool. To clean. Too soft. Not from any sheep you've touched. The storm picks up again, and your host decides everyone should sleep in the main room tonight. Strength in numbers, or at least fewer walls between you and your potential rescuers. You agree, dragging your pallet near the hearth. Just before bed, the old uncle offers to tell a story. No one says no. He leans close, eyes glittering in the firelight, and tells you about the Mjögelf, the snow sheep, said to walk only during blizzards, white on white, invisible to the eye but not to the ear. They don't bleat, he says, they whisper. In voices borrowed from your dreams. They don't eat grass, they eat memory. You'll forget your name first, he says, poking at the fire, then your warmth, then where your skin ends. He chuckles. You do not. Historians still argue whether Mjögelf was a real part of Icelandic folklore or a modern embellishment, something invented during the 19th century Romantic revival. But in this room, with the fire dying and the wind gnawing at the shutters, nobody's checking sources. They're checking shadows. That night, you lie awake in the shared room, listening to the breathing of others, the crack of ice outside, the faint creak of timbers. Your fingers twitch involuntarily, gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. You're almost asleep when it happens. A soft puff of air at your ear. A breath, you spin, heart thudding. But there's no one there. Everyone is sleeping, except the dog, who is wide awake, ears flattened, staring at the far wall, where something is pressing. Not visible, but the wood bulges slightly, like a slow breath. You whisper the first line of a prayer you don't actually know. Just something. To fill the air. The pressure eases. The wall relaxes. The dog crawls under the bench again. And you lie awake until dawn, counting the sheep. Not to fall asleep. To make sure their number doesn't change. Daylight crawls across the sky like it's ashamed to be here. The pale grey above offers no warmth, no reassurance, just a dull reminder that time is still moving. Even if the sun has given up on enthusiasm, you rise stiffly from the floor, the blanket wrapped around you like armor. No one speaks of the night. No one asks if you slept. Everyone looks tired, and one of the bone sheep is missing from the table. You eat breakfast in silence. Someone adds extra salt to the fish. No one complains. The wind rattles the shutter again, and everyone flinches except the daughter, who calmly continues carving something beneath the table. Outside, the sheep are restless. Their breath clouds in the air, their ears flick nervously, and one you recognize refuses to eat. It just stands there, staring at the croft. You make eye contact. Bad idea. It doesn't blink. You volunteer to walk into town. You need air, or distance, or distraction. Your host agrees to quickly. It's a long, icy trek to the village, but it clears your head. Sort of. Along the way, you pass empty fields. The fences are down, and the snow is smooth. No prints, no sheep, just absence. When you arrive, the town looks normal. For about 5 minutes. Then you hear the rumor. A shepherd has vanished. He was last seen chasing a stray up toward the bridge. Never came back. They found his crook, his gloves, and his hat, all neatly laid in a line. No footprints leaving the spot. Just a single, spiraling indentation in the snow, like something heavy was spun there. You don't stick around long. I watch you came for dried fish, wool thread, a new knife, and leave before someone decides to tell another story. On the way home, you pause on the ridge where the shepherd disappeared. There's a wind here, swirling the snow, whispering. Nonsense. You kneel briefly to tighten your boots and find something half buried in the drift. A scrap of fleece, not white, not black, a sort of silver grey, with a shimmer when the light hits it wrong. You pocket it without thinking. Back at the croft, the daughter sees it and goes pale. That's not from here, she says. That's from them. You try to return it to the snow. It won't leave your hand. That night, you wrap it in cloth and put it under a heavy pot, just to be safe. The pot creaks as if it's being pushed from below. You sleep in the shared room again. No one protests. The wind returns around midnight, dragging something behind it. You hear dragging outside the door. Not walking, dragging, as if hooves are being pulled. Unwillingly. And then to bleat, sharp, wrong, like a cough from a cracked throat. You close your eyes and press your hands over your ears. But it's inside your head now. The sound, the feeling, the presence. The croft holds its breath. The fire flickers. A bowl falls from a shelf. No reason, no warning. Then silence, total, consuming silence. And then very gently a pressure at the door. Not a knock. A lean, like someone or something is resting its head against it. You don't move. The pressure stays for 5 long minutes. Then lifts. In the morning, the door frame has a dampering, the shape of a sheep's skull, faintly outlined in steam. Historians still argue whether the ancient Icelanders believed their livestock could carry spirits, or become vessels for them. Some claim these stories were warnings. Others think they were metaphors for disease, famine, or loneliness. But the daughter says they come back when they're missed too loudly. You don't ask her to explain. You're afraid she might. You begin to keep watch without realizing it, at the edge of chores, mid-conversation. Even while eating, your eyes flick to the corners, the windows, the places where air seems just a little too still. Everyone else does it too. It's not paranoia. It's etiquette. The bone sheep are multiplying. There are now 6 on the table, 3 under the shelf, 1 perched atop the cupboard like a very judgmental gargoyle. You don't ask who's making them anymore. They just appear. One has its mouth open. Another has a missing leg. All of them face inward. That evening, the host quietly tells you that the bishop won't be arriving alone. He's bringing a Sagnum or a story man. Not a priest, not a magician, but someone who listens to legends like their legal testimony. A scholar of ghosts, a handler of hauntings. You'd think this would comfort you. It doesn't. The uncle says these men don't fight spirits, they negotiate with them. Sometimes they win. He shrugs. Sometimes they join the flock. You consider faking a head injury and catching the next drift out of town. Instead, you go with the daughter to collect moss for the animals' bedding. It's a simple task, quiet, repetitive, grounded. The moss is thick and frozen but pliable, and for a while, everything feels normal, peaceful. Then she stops. She's staring at a patch of moss that isn't right. Not brown, not green, but pale and woolly. She bends down and brushes it gently. With her gloved fingers, it peels up in one piece. Not moss, fleece, just lying there. Perfectly shaped like a folded sheep, pressed flat to the earth. No blood, no bones, just an impression, like something rested here a very long time, or was waiting. She looks at you. You both say nothing. Back at the croft, the fleece is burned in silence. Later, as smoke curls from the chimney, the matron shares a story. Not one from the bishop's book, one from her own grandmother. Long ago, she says, when the land was colder and the sheep thinner, people whispered of the Kinju, not the sheep night. A single night when the flocks would disappear, only to return hours later, eyes glazed and legs trembling, with no memory of where they'd gone. Afterward, strange things happened. Sheep refused to enter their pens. Children mumbled in their sleep. About the grey pasture, milk would curdle before sunrise. Sometimes a second flock would appear identical to the first. You had to choose which one to keep. Historians still argue whether these doubling legends originated from real cases of flock confusion during winter migrations, or if they point to a deeper fear that you might misrecognize the familiar, love the wrong copy, feed what doesn't belong. You ask what happens if someone picks the wrong flock. No one answers. The wind outside picks up again, carrying flecks of ash from the burned fleece. You go to bed with the smell still clinging to your clothes, burnt wool and lichen. Sleep doesn't come quickly. When it does, it brings dreams of fences with no gates, of sheep whose shadows move before they do, and of hoofprints that appear upside down, stamped into the ceiling. You wake suddenly. The room's still dark. You reach for your blanket. It's gone. In its place. Fleece. Soft, silvery grey fleece, still warm. You back away slowly, heart pounding. And as you do, you hear it. A whisper. Not from outside. From beneath the fleece. One word. In a voice that sounds almost like yours. Bark. You don't scream. You can't. Your throat clenches the way your jaw might when you see a shadow move that shouldn't. The fleece lies where your blanket should be, gently pulsing with residual warmth. You don't want to touch it, but you also don't want to look away. Then it shifts. Not much, just a slight twitch at the edge. As though something beneath it rolled over in sleep, you stand. Slowly, quietly, you back away. Hands raised like you're negotiating with a very small, very fluffy bomb. 1 step, 2. You reach the door, open it carefully, and step into the hall. No one else is awake. Or if they are, they're pretending not to be, which, honestly, you respect. You go outside. The wind slaps your face like a wake-up call from the underworld. Snow swirls sideways, caught in eddies around the croft. You're barefoot, but your feet don't feel cold. You realize, dimly, that this might be a problem. You find the daughter in the shed. She's awake, bundled in furs, scratching more runes onto the doorframe with a piece of charcoal. I didn't touch it, you say. She nods, not looking at you. They'll leave it soon. It's only borrowed warmth. You ask what they want. They want to be remembered. That phrase sticks in your mind like a splinter, wanting to be remembered. The most human motive of all. But when sheep want it, something else rides in that wish. A creature that doesn't know what it means to end. That morning, the snow finally stops, and then, as if summoned by the clearing sky, the bishop returns. He arrives with 2 others, the Sagnamaor, who looks like he hasn't blinked since 1603, and a quiet man with a burlap sack that twitches. They do not ask for tea. Instead, they walk the perimeter of the croft, murmuring to each other in Latin and Icelandic, and something that sounds like gravel being poured into a cup. The Sagnamaor asks to see the fleece you slept beneath. You show him. He picks it up, turns it over, sniffs it once. Then he says, "It's only part of it." That night, a ritual begins. They light a circle of oil lamps in the snow, around a stone ring just past the sheepfold. Everyone is asked to bring something old, not valuable remembered. Items with weight, with story, a knife passed down, a comb carved from driftwood, even a cracked teacup. You offer the wooden sheep the daughter gave you. She nods in approval. The bishop arranges it near the center of the ring. The man with the twitching sack steps forward, empties it and upends the contents. What falls is not a lamb. It's a fleece. Tangled, grey, wet with something that isn't quite water. The wind stills. The night goes quiet. Even the sheep stop breathing, and then movement from all sides. Shadows sliding over snow, too slow to be wind, too soft to be people. The bishop raises his voice, not loud but solid, like a weight placed gently on the world. He begins to speak. A litany. Names. Dates. Numbers. You realize he's reading registry entries. Every sheep lost, every shepherd buried, every field abandoned. He's speaking them back into the world. The Sagnamaor kneels, draws a rune in ash. It looks like a spiral stabbed through with hooves. The fleece twitches. Once, twice. Then unfolds. A shape rises, vague, legless, draped in wool, but somehow towering. Not threatening, just present, like someone who wants to explain, but doesn't. Know your language. The bishop steps aside. The daughter walks into the ring, and she says, very softly, "You can go now. We'll keep the stories." There's a sound like a sigh, a heavy exhale, then silence, and the fleece collapses. Still, empty, cold. Historians still argue whether such rituals ever happened, or whether they're modern reconstructions, folk theatre mistaken for fact. But standing in that snowy ring with ash in your nose and your hands full of trembling, you're inclined to believe, later, back in the croft, you sleep deeply. No dreams. No whispers. The fleece is gone. The bone sheep have stopped multiplying. And when you wake, your blanket is back, folded, warm, untouched. You wake to birdsong. It's so startling, so shockingly normal, that it takes you a few seconds to recognize it for what it is. A ptarmigan, maybe 2, warbling their scratchy little melodies from the rocky ridge. You haven't heard birds in days, maybe weeks. The air feels different too, less heavy, like the croft has exhaled. There's movement in the kitchen, the matron humming, someone chopping turnips, the daughter laughing an actual, human laugh as she scolds the dog for stealing a boot. It feels like the fog has lifted, but not completely, more like someone has pulled it back just far enough for you to see again. The bishop and his people are packing up. They say nothing about what happened the night before. No grand declarations, no instructions, just quiet. Efficiency. The burlap sack now hangs limp at the Sagnamaor's side, like an empty winter skin. You don't ask what's inside it now. Before they leave, the bishop gives your host a small bundle wrapped in sheep's wool. Inside, salt iron, filings and a tiny iron bell. Hang this by your door, he says, and never forget their names. Your host bows, says nothing. Later, while helping the matron card wool, you ask what the bishop meant. She shrugs, her hands moving rhythmically through the fleece. Ghosts are like dead, she says. They only stay quiet when you remember who owes what. It's a lovely day, by Icelandic standards, windy, grey, and only slightly freezing. You take a walk to the ridge, just to move, to see where the shepherd vanished. The snow there is still patchy, but no longer wrong. No spirals, no backwards hooves, just melt and moss and a few cautious sprouts of grass. The river below rushes with meltwater. You think of all the things it's carried over the years: fish, bones, lost boots, old stories. On the way back, you pass the sheep. They watch you as always, but now their gazes feel blank, empty in a good way, like actual sheep, not imposters, not avatars of lost memory. One of them sneezes and farts at the same time. You almost cry with relief. But then, just as you're turning to leave, you see her at the edge of the flock. The ewe with the torn ear. You remember her from that first day when the fold felt wrong. You remember how she vanished, how the bishop called her claimed, how no one could explain where she went. But here she is. Just standing, eating, completely unremarkable. You step closer. She raises her head, and there, on her forehead, faint but unmistakable, is a mark, a spiral. Not drawn. Grown. You don't move. You don't speak. And then she blinks. Normal. Calm. Sheep dash like. And turns away. You say nothing when you return to the croft. You help make dinner. You slice dried fish. You sweep the floor. Later that evening, the daughter gives you a fresh carving. Wood. Again. Polished smooth. A sheep curled into sleep. Its eyes are closed this time. She doesn't say what it's for. She doesn't need to. Historians still argue whether this kind of sheep law ever influenced Icelandic agricultural practice. Some say it's all metaphor, grief in animal form, fear wrapped in wool. Others insist it's just one more way Icelanders learned to process the long, brutal dark. But some stories don't care who believes them. They just wait. And sometimes they return. You keep the carving by your bed, just in case. It takes a few days before you stop flinching at creaks in the floorboards, before you can fall asleep without listening first, just to make sure nothing's breathing under your bed, before the bone sheep on the cupboard still there, still. Watchful feels more like a decoration than a threat. Spring is trying, half-heartedly, to arrive. The snow isn't retreating exactly, but it's sagging, tired, soggy, starting to slouch into meltwater and ice slush. The sheep are moving more, freely now, roaming further from the fold, no longer clustering so tightly. You still count them every morning, just to be safe. The daughter has started carving birds now, smooth little ptarmigans with stubby tails and sleepy eyes. She gives you one after breakfast. So your dreams have somewhere to land, she says. You don't even ask what that means anymore. Instead, you help your host repair the boundary wall, the low ring of rocks that circles the property. It's more symbolic than defensive, but symbols of teeth here. The stones are heavy, moss-covered, and often cold with hidden frost, but you move them anyway. It's strangely satisfying. As you lift one particularly flat rock, you uncover something unexpected, a small circle of bones. Not buried, just arranged. Tiny vertebrae, probably from a lamb, bleached white, perfectly clean, curled in a spiral pattern like a sleeping thing or a silent warning. Your host looks at them, squints and mutters they left messages. He doesn't clarify who they are. You rebury the bones, just in case. They're still listening. Later that day, a man from the next croft over stops by. He looks exhausted, like someone who hasn't slept in years but only recently realized it. His flock, he says, has started refusing to enter the pen. They bunch at the edge, then split, every single one walking backward around the fence instead of through it. You glance at your host. He doesn't even look surprised. He invites the man in, offers him dried fish, and starts boiling herbs in a small iron pot. The smell is pungent burnt mint, salt, and something bitter, and the steam curls thickly through the room. They talk in low tones while the daughter carves another bird and the old uncle mends a glove. With suspiciously thick thread, you sip your tea and quietly move the ptarmigan carving from the windowsill to your coat pocket. That night, the wind returns, but it feels different now. Not hostile. Not hungry, just Cold. Outside, you hear the sheep rustling. A few soft bleats, a stomp, a sneeze. Nothing strange. But then the dog lifts its head, ear stiff, and growls low. You freeze. There's a sound in the yard. Not ableat. Not wind. Something. Brushing. Dragging. You peer through the shutters. Nothing. And then, just as you're about to turn away, you see it. A trail, leading from the fold to the corner of the croft. Not footprints this time. Not hoofprints. Just a line. A long, shallow indentation. Like something was pulled or dragged itself. In the morning, it's still there. Not snowed over. Still fresh. You follow it. It ends at the compost pit. Inside, a heap of old vegetable peelings, fish bones. And sitting directly on top, a bone sheep. One you've never seen. Its eyes are closed. Its mouth is open. And from inside that tiny, open mouth, something glints. You reach down with your knife just to poke it. A sound bursts from it. High-pitched. Not quite a bleat. Not quite. A whistle, more like a kettle boiling backwards. The dog yelps and bolts. You drop the knife. The sound stops. You don't touch it again. Instead, you cover the pit with a board and weigh it down with 3 large stones and a silent prayer. Historians still argue whether early Icelanders genuinely believed objects could catch spirits like a haunting transmitted through wool, stone, or bone, or whether these were cautionary tales told to keep children from playing in strange corners of the house. But you're not a child, and you're definitely never playing in the compost again. You keep your distance from the compost pit after that. No one mentions the bone sheep buried under the stones, but you catch the daughter glancing toward it once during supper. Just a flick of her eyes, quick, deliberate, like she's counting. The wind hasn't returned, but the quiet has. Not peace, just a kind of hush, like the land itself is listening, waiting, watching. You start noticing little changes around the croft. The sheep are less jittery. They come when called, more or less. One even lets you scratch behind its ears again. The matron hangs new herbs above the door, angelica, sea wormwood, and something else you can't name. The birds are louder now. Their calls cut across the sky like tiny announcements. Still here, still alive, still ordinary. And then you find the tooth. It's lying on the windowsill in your room. Small, yellow, flat-topped. Not human. Definitely Ovini. But it's not dirty. It's polished, smooth as glass, warm to the touch. You don't know how it got there. No one in the household says they put it there. The dog sniffs it once and immediately walks out of the room. You consider throwing it into the fire, but instead, for reasons you'll never quite understand, you wrap it in cloth and keep it in your pocket. Just in case. That evening, the uncle decides it's time to tell the real story. You're all gathered around the fire again. Bellies full, the wind quiet, the moon glowing through the smoke hole above like a shy god. He leans forward, voice low and dry, and tells you the tale of the Skagaf, the shadow flock. Long ago, he says, there was a man who loved his sheep more than anything, treated them like family, talked to them, sang to them, even buried them when they died proper graves, with stones and names and bits of fleece folded like shrouds. People laughed. But the sheep thrived, until one winter they were stolen. All of them, gone in one night. No tracks, no broken fence, no sounds. Just silence and an empty fold. The man lost his mind with grief. He wandered the hills, calling their names, weeping into the wind, offering his own soul in exchange. Something listened. The next full moon, the sheep returned. But they were wrong. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep, and they wouldn't let him touch them. They just stood in the yard night after night, until one morning he was gone. All that remained were hoofprints. On the roof. The Skagaf, the uncle says, aren't ghosts. They're grief-wearing wool, memory with teeth. They don't haunt because they're evil. They haunt because they were wanted back. Historians still argue whether this story is unique to the West Fjords, or if versions of it circulated through other Icelandic valleys. Some see it as symbolic of hardship and psychological collapse during the long winters. Others believe it originated from actual losses, disease, famine, or sheep rustling turned into myth. But you're not thinking about that right now. You're thinking about the boned sheep in the compost, the tooth in your pocket, and the unshakable feeling that something has chosen to remember you. You tried to sleep early that night. The wind is calm, the animals are quiet. There's nothing to be afraid of. Until the boards above your bed creak slowly rhythmically like hoof steps. You stare at the ceiling. You wait and then, softly, impossibly, a bleat from underneath the floor. You lie completely still, listening. The bleat comes again, muffled, low, drawn out like someone trying to imitate a sheep underwater. It's not angry, not panicked, just there, uninvited, undeniable. You hold your breath, trying to calculate just how much space exists between the floorboards and the cold earth beneath the croft. Not much, not enough for anything to move around, unless it isn't moving with a body, unless it never needed one. The sound fades. You don't sleep in the morning. You make excuses to step outside early. The frost crunches under your boots, your breath plumes in the air, and your legs ache with tiredness. But you check beneath the croft anyway, just in case. There's nothing obvious. No tracks, no holes, no misplaced boards, just a long, damp stretch of earth undisturbed. But somehow, watched. You whisper no thank you and back away. At breakfast, everyone is quiet again. The daughter doesn't even carve. The uncle eats with one hand in his coat pocket, which twitches every few minutes. You don't ask why. The day passes. Like slow breath, you help oil the tools. You restack firewood. You mend a torn blanket that isn't yours and maybe never was. And then, just before dusk, something strange happens. The sheep come home early. All of them. Quiet, alert, walking single file down the path like students in a drill. No bleating, no sniffing, just straight to the fold and in, except for one. It stops at the edge of the property and stares directly at the croft. You step outside, squinting against the wind, and it meets your gaze, and then it turns around and lies down, facing the wrong direction. Away from shelter, away from the fold, toward the hills. Your host joins you silently, arms crossed. She's called them, he says. You ask who. He just nods toward the sheep. She was never ours, just borrowing the shape. You want to laugh or run, or both, but you just watch as the sheep's ears flick once, and then it bleats, and from the hills, faintly, impossibly, comes another bleat in response. That night, no one eats much. The dog won't stop pacing. The old uncle wraps twine around his wrist and whispers, what sound like numbers? The daughter lays 7 iron nails in a circle round her bed. You place your little ptarmigan carving on the floor, facing the door. When the wind rises, it doesn't sound like wind. It sounds like rubbing, dragging, following. You bury yourself under the blanket. Your blanket, no fleece substitutes tonight, and wait. Then the tapping begins. Not knocking, not scratching. Just a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the window beside your bed. You don't look, you can't, but you hear it breathe. Close, slow, and then it says your name. Only once. In your voice. In a way you've never heard yourself say it. You don't sleep. You wait for it to go. It never does. But eventually the tapping stops, and you finally, mercifully, pass out. You wake up at dawn to find the ptarmigan carving broken into. No one else heard the tapping, or they're pretending they didn't. You keep the splinters anyway. Historians still argue whether Icelandic ghost lore represents a fear of death or of returning to life in the wrong form. Some interpret it as trauma wearing masks. Others see it as deep environmental anxiety, a land so alive that even grief takes shape. You're starting to think it's none of those, or maybe all of them, because something in the hills is still calling, and something in you is starting to listen back. The next day begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind, more like the breathless pause before something breaks. The sheep don't stir. The birds are absent. Even the wind seems to hesitate. It's the kind of quiet that doesn't feel earned. You find the host standing in the yard, arms crossed, staring toward the hills. He doesn't speak when you approach, just points. At first, you don't see it. Then you do, a thin line of prints barely visible in the snow, like they were laid by something too light to leave much of a mark. Hoof prints, but not in pairs, just one dot over and over. A single, one-legged thing walking in a perfect line. You don't follow them, neither does he. Instead, you gather the tools, not weapons, just tools. Iron spade, copper bell, knife made from horn, not because you expect to use them, but because doing nothing feels worse. The uncle says, "It's getting close to the kind, you not." The sheep night, you nod like you know what that means. He says, they'll try again, this time they'll be gentle. That night, the dog won't come inside. It stands at the doorway, growling low, refusing every coax and bribe. The daughter doesn't force him, just puts a hand on his back and whispers something you don't catch. You sleep in the main room again. Everyone does. No one says why. The fire is low. The light flickers across the floorboards. You keep your carving splinters in your hand like a charm or a confession. Then the fold goes silent. It's the kind of silence that yanks you upright. You sit up, so does the daughter. The uncle is already awake, eyes fixed on the window. No bletting. No shifting. Just quiet. To quiet. You move to the door. You open it slowly. Outside, the sheep are still. Not asleep, not grazing, just still. All facing the croft. All eyes open. All absolutely silent. And behind them, barely visible against the dark snow, are others. Not sheep, not entirely. Shapes in wool, long-limbed, low-slung, shimmering at the edges like breath on glass. Not walking, gliding. Not alive, but not fully absent either. And they're watching. You can't tell if they have eyes, but you feel it. The daughter steps out beside you, holding the iron bell. She rings it once. The sound is flat, dull, like it can't find the air. She rings it again. No reaction. The shadows keep watching. And then one of the sheep steps forward. The same you as before, the one with the spiral on her brow. She walks past the others, silent, calm, right to the edge of the yard, and stops. She looks at you. Then turns and begins walking away toward the hills. The other sheep follow, one by one, not rushed, not panicked. Just obedient. And the shadows follow too, sliding between them. Like threads weaving through wool. You don't stop them. No one does. The last to leave is the ewe. She pauses at the ridge. Turns her head and blats. One low note. Sad. But satisfied. Then disappears into the dark. In the morning, the fold is empty. No tracks. No droppings. No broken gates. Just silence. And a single bone sheep on the threshold. Eyes open, mouth shut. Historians still argue whether the Kindernacht was ever a real ritual, or just a metaphor, a seasonal event warped by memory and fear. But something happened. Enough that stories kept repeating. Enough that bells were made. Enough that people still watch their flocks, even now, even in dreams. You pick up the bone sheep. It crumbles in your hands. Dust and ash. You don't tell anyone. That day, you help rebuild the fence again. Not because the sheep are coming back, but because some boundaries still matter. You'd think the quiet would bring relief, but it doesn't. The fold stands empty, gate swinging gently in the wind, and the croft itself feels hollow, not haunted, not anymore, just echoing, like someone sang here once and then left without finishing the song. No one mentions replacing the sheep. Your host sharpens tools that don't need sharpening. The daughter carves abstract shapes, now nothing with eyes, nothing with hooves. The uncle has taken to sitting outside on a stool, staring at the horizon like it owes him something. You don't ask what anyone is thinking. You don't need to. Everyone is waiting for something to not happen. That evening, a stranger arrives. He's young, bundled in wool and ambition, face red from the cold. Says he's from a croft across the valley. Heard about the cleansing. Wants to know if it worked, if it's safe to return to the old pasture up by the Black Ridge. Your host doesn't answer immediately, just pours the man a cup of sour milk and nods toward the hearth. You watch them talk quietly for a while. The visitor leans in, eager, scribbling in a notebook. Your host leans back, not smiling. Eventually, the man asks if he can stay the night. Just in case something walks, he says, laughing nervously. They let him, but no one laughs back. That night, you share the main room again. The man keeps talking. Even as the candles burn low, he says there are new theories folk structures built around climate, not spirits, that the old stories were ways to measure weather patterns, that the skagave might have been hallucinations caused by mold or isolation. You nod politely, but you're watching the window, because there's fog rolling in again, thick, low. 2. Fast it presses against the glass like breath. You all fall silent at the same time. Then, scratching not at the door underneath the floor creaks. The uncle stands and presses a hand to the wall. He doesn't look surprised. The daughter pulls a rune-carved plank from under her mattress, places it across the threshold. You reach into your coat and touch the carved bird splinters still tucked in the lining. The visitor looks pale. What is that? He whispers. You say, it's nothing if we're lucky. He doesn't sleep. Neither do you. In the morning, the fog is gone. The visitor is gone to not just from the croft. Gone. No note, no tracks, no mug. The only sign he was ever there, his notebook lying open on the floor, last line half written. A second flock emerges from the you burn it. The others don't object. Historians still argue whether stories like this, the ones with vanishing outsiders and unfinished sentences, were designed to keep locals in and strangers out. Whether the tale is the warning or the consequence, whether belief itself is the invitation. But you don't care what they argue. You just start watching the hills more closely again. You're seated now in a stiff-backed chair in a modest sitting room, the kind that smells faintly of paraffin and slightly overboiled cabbage. The tea has gone tepid. A cat is eyeing you from under the settee, but you're not here for conversation or cucumber sandwiches. You're here for something far more thrilling. A look at someone's private fern album, because while grand gardens and fern rooms got all the attention, the real heart of pterodomania often lived between two sheets of buckram and string. This particular album is worn at the corners, but lovingly kept. A small embossed plate on the cover reads, Miss Henrietta W. Gadsworth, 1875. The spine creaks gently as you open it, and just like that, you're inside another world. The first page is careful, almost shy. One perfect frond of Asplenium scolopendrium, pressed flat, stem aligned precisely with the binding. Beneath it, a note, found near Aunt's gate, slightly bruised, still lovely. Victorians of all classes created these albums. Some were grand, some humble, but all had the same purpose: to catalogue, preserve, and quietly adore the delicate perfection of ferns. Mainstream historical fact: fern albums became wildly popular during the fern craze, often given as gifts, passed down through families, or swapped among collectors like trading cards made of chlorophyll. You flip carefully through the pages. Here's a lacy adianum, featherlight and fragile. Over there, a proud polystichum. Its note reading, discovered in fog, slipped twice, but it's more than just botany. There's storytelling here, collected after the storm still dripping, found during argument, mood lifted. This one followed me home, figuratively. Each frond a little emotional timestamp. You imagine Miss Gadsworth, bonnet askew, kneeling in the mud with ink-stained fingers, carefully sliding each specimen into wax paper. And these weren't mass-produced albums. Many were handmade. The paper was often linen or cotton, rag acid-free, if you were lucky. The pressing process involved blotting paper, weights, and patience. Some enthusiasts kept their ferns under family Bibles to ensure even flattening. There's a joke in here somewhere about spiritual pressure and foliage, but let's move on. A quirky tidbit: there were actually fern album competitions. Judges awarded points not just for rare species, but for arrangement, penmanship, and overall grace of presentation. The 1884 winner of the Norwich Ladies Fern Society submitted a trifold album that included a poem for each frond. The poem for Dryopteris filixmars rhymed evergreen with unseen. Bold. Historians still argue whether these albums were scientific documents or romantic scrapbookery. The line was thin. For every album with Latin labels and detailed locations, there was another filled with watercolors, pressed violets, and the occasional lock of hair tucked between fronds. You pause on a spread showing ferns from a single village, lane each labeled by location, near postbox, under style, by Mr. Calthorpe's Angry Goose. It's oddly moving. A map of someone's small, beloved world rendered in green. There's something else tucked into the spine of folded letter. You carefully slide it out. The handwriting is looped and precise. Dearest H, I send this frond not for rarity, but for memory. Do you recall the day we walked to Whitby, the air thick with salt and rain? This fern came from the cliff path. It reminds me of your coat, your grin, the way your bonnet tried to flee in the wind. I keep it close, yours always M. You place the letter back where it was. Who M was, we'll never know. A cousin, a friend, something more. The fern doesn't say, but it remembers. In this small room, in this little album, there's a hole. Life pressed between pages, rainy walks, scraped knees, quiet victories. The thrill of finding a new species or just the joy of seeing a familiar one. Still there, still growing. One page contains only one word beneath the fern, survived. No context, no location, just that. You find yourself nodding. That's enough. Sometimes these albums were also tools of connection. Some families created fern letters where pressed fronds and notes were sent back and forth, each adding their own finds, a kind of Victorian plant-based pen pal system. One woman reportedly had 5 ongoing fern correspondences across 3 counties and said she preferred it to courting. Fair. And here's a detail few people mention. Pressing ferns was slow. You couldn't rush it. You had to wait days, sometimes weeks. It taught patience, attentiveness, care. In an era spinning ever faster with steam and soot, the fern album was a small, stubborn act of quiet. You close Miss Gadsworth's album gently. The cat stirs unimpressed. Outside, a cart rolls past, its wheels clattering on cobblestones. Inside, the room holds its breath, and as you stand to leave, you realize you've just read a diary but one written in fronds and footnotes in moss and margins. A green autobiography of someone you'll never meet, and yet now somehow know. The Victorians didn't just love ferns. They trusted them to hold their memories, to mark their days, to remind them of where they'd been and who they were becoming. Pressed, but not forgotten. Today, you're on a train, a proper, puffing, slightly sooty Victorian train, rattling its way across the English countryside. The window beside you is smudged, the seat scratchy, and the tea served lukewarm in a cup that may or may not have been washed since the Crimean War. But you're not here for the luxury. You're on your way to one of the great social phenomena of the 19th century. The fern hunting excursion. Yes, organized trips by rail, coach, or foot into the wild for the sole purpose of collecting ferns. What began as a hobby for solitary wanderers quickly evolved into a social event. Entire groups packed up baskets, field guides, and questionable sandwiches to brave the countryside in search of elusive fronds. Mainstream historical fact. By the 1860s and 70s, fern hunting excursions were regularly advertised in newspapers and organized by local natural history clubs, schools, and, of course, fern societies. They often combined botany, fresh air, and if the organizers were optimistic, character building. The whistle blows as the train pulls into a modest station, and you join the flurry of passengers disembarking, many clutching walking sticks, and canvas bags already peering eagerly at nearby hedgerows. Your group an enthusiastic mix of schoolboys, stern aunties, and one suspiciously overdressed man named Reginald assembles near a field path. Someone hands you a folded pamphlet titled Common Ferns of Devonshire and their associated mirths. The associated mirths remain unspecified. The countryside is damp as usual, the path muddy, but spirits are high. You all set off together. A ragtag parade of naturalists, each with one goal, to find something rare. Or at least to say you did dot as you trudge up a gentle slope. The air smells of wet grass and sheep-related decisions. You hear snippets of conversation. It's got the sorry, but not the stalk hair. My uncle says Dryopterus is the work of the devil. Don't step there. It's boggy. Squelch! A young girl proudly brandishes a freshly plucked Blecknim spikenard, while her brother sulks over her. Mere moss clump. Not even a liverwort, he mutters. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some fern hunting excursions offered prizes. Most unusual find. Most complete root system, and in one truly niche case, best identified penny under duress. The winner was a man who correctly classified a fern while being stung by bees. You pause beside a shady wall where a few brave fronds peek out. A woman in a bonnet, clearly the expert of the group, leans in and murmurs, Asplenium rutimeraria. Good eye, but too common. Move along. The fern, for its part, does not care. The pace slows as the group spreads out. You hear laughter ahead. Someone's slipped on a rock and landed beside a perfectly intact Polypodium vulgare. See? She grins, holding it up. Worth it. Historians still argue whether these excursions were more about socializing than science. It's true they provided the rare opportunity for unchaperoned young people to chat beneath the guise of plant appreciation. One minister wrote disapprovingly that fern hunts were an occasion for flirtation and muddy hands. The next week, 2 of his parishioners eloped with a fern, probably dot by midday. You've reached the designated picnic site, a clearing beside a stream, where blankets are laid out and baskets opened with theatrical flair. The sandwiches are soggy, the lemonade warm, and someone forgot the cutlery. But no one minds. The stream gurgles contentedly nearby, and ferns of every kind frame. The scene like an oil painting. People compare finds. One woman produced a velvet-lined case containing a folded pressing kit, and announces that she's located a hybrid probably. Her companion responds by waving a truly bedraggled fern and declaring, Mine fought back. You lie back on the grass and look up through the trees. Dappled sunlight filters through soft, flickering, fern-like. You realize the appeal of these outings wasn't just the plants. It was this, the moment of peace, of shared purpose, of green stillness in a noisy world. The return trip is quieter, pleasantly tired. The group meanders back toward the train station. Mud-streaked and content. There are fewer arguments now, more quiet exchanges. Did you see that patch near the stile? I think I dropped my guidebook by the gorse. We should do this again. One elderly gentleman, the kind who wears his socks very high and his spectacles very low, clutches his bag with obvious pride. Inside is a small, unremarkable fern. Nothing rare. He says, but it was mine to find. You board the train with your own frond carefully tucked into a folded envelope. It's slightly crushed. It's definitely common, but you feel a little closer to it now, like maybe you earned it. As the train chugs back toward the city, the countryside rolls past. Your window in fading light. You think about the strange joy of walking with strangers, the delight of green things in unexpected places, and the satisfying ache of your legs after a good, pointless adventure. And you realize something. Pterodomania wasn't just about ferns. It was about seeking, about looking closer, about being the kind of person who kneels beside a mossy wall and thinks, maybe, just maybe, there's something beautiful here. You close your eyes, head against the train window, and let the rhythm of the tracks lull you back into stillness. Somewhere behind you, a fern grows quietly in a paper packet, and that's enough. You're at a garden party, but not the kind with cucumber sandwiches and tepid gin, no. This one is different. It's formal, yes, but there's an edge to the atmosphere, a glint in the eyes of the guests that has nothing to do with sunlight, on crystal, because tonight you've wandered into the glorious, ridiculous world of fern competitions. Yes, fern competitions. Imagine dog shows, but greener, less barking, marginally less scandal. The grounds are immaculately kept, lawns rolled, flat, white tents fluttering gently in the breeze. A brass band plays, something vaguely triumphant in the distance, and everywhere you turn, there are tables long, cloth-covered tables groaning under the weight of potted ferns. There's a Dryopteris affinis in a mahogany planter, a polystichum, Setiphyrum twirling elegantly in an ornate iron urn. A young man adjusts the position of a blechnum spikened by precisely for degrees, and then steps back to admire it, arms folded, lips pursed. This is serious business. Mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s, fern shows were regular fixtures in the calendars of horticultural societies across Britain. They were judged events complete with prizes, certificates, and occasionally engraved watering cans for the best in show. The Royal Horticultural Society even introduced fern-specific categories to accommodate demand. And it wasn't just about showing off one's fronds. These events were social battlegrounds polite, perfumed jewels of cultivation. Winning a prize meant recognition, status, possibly even a small write-up in the Gardener's Weekly Gazette. Losing meant 3 weeks of sulking and writing passive-aggressive notes about someone else's inferior story. You drift toward the judging tent, where a small crowd has gathered. Inside, 3 elderly men and 1 very composed lady are peering at a cyathier deal barter as though it might confess to tax fraud. Judging criteria are strict: uniformity of fronds, absence of pests, appropriate moisture, graceful presentation, and above all, purity of species. None of this hybrid nonsense, as one judge mutters, filthy crossbreeding. Historians still argue whether these competitions helped advance botanical knowledge or just encouraged snobbery. Likely both. One recorded argument from 1883 escalated when a judge accused a contestant of unnaturally fertilizing their aetherium. That's Victorian for cheating, or something much worse, depending on the accent. A quirky tidbit: at the 1887 London Fern Exhibition, one man attempted to pass off a plastic well wax fern as a real specimen. He was disqualified immediately, but later sold the model to a department store for window displays. Too beautiful to be real, the clerk reportedly said. Indeed. Back at the party, a bell rings. Judging is over. The results are in. A hush falls. First place in the native species. Indoor-grown category goes to Miss Cecily Farrow for her Asplenium scolopendrium, lovingly cultivated from spore and tended with Mozart and moral poetry. The crowd applauds. Her frond glistens. Her rivals grit their teeth so hard you can hear it beneath the brass band's triumphant reprise. Second place is awarded posthumously, not to a deceased person but to a fern. The note reads, would have taken gold if not tragically overwatered. A cautionary tale into words, soggy roots. You wander among the losing tables. Some entries are perfectly fine, lush, proud, green, but in a field this competitive, fine is failure. One plant leans to the left like it's given up entirely. The label simply reads, Eleanor's regret. A young boy nearby is arguing with a judge, but it's the only one with a name. He insists it's Jeremy. The judge sighs. We do not award points for personification. Some guests are clearly here for the show rather than the science. A man in a lemon-colored waistcoat is sketching ferns while dramatically sipping punch. A woman in an oversized bonnet claims to have never touched soil in her life, but came for the aesthetic. She's currently trying to flirt with a judge by quoting the Fairy Queen and batting her eyelashes over a potted adianum. The fern seems unimpressed. And here's the wild part: people would travel by train for hours, with carts full of potted ferns. Some used bespoke fern transportation crates, lined with moss and moist cloths. Others simply sat with them on their laps like leafy infants. One attendee in 1879 was fined for taking up to full train seats, one for herself, one for her Lomaria gibber. It dislikes jostling, she said. You stop by the refreshments tent. There's lemonade, seed cake, and, inexplicably, small sandwiches cut into fern shapes. A man with pince nez is holding court about Tris cretica, gesturing wildly enough to scatter crumbs into a nearby specimen. You realize, somewhere between the awards and the sketching, and the minor scandals, that this isn't really about ferns. Not entirely. It's about belonging, having a passion, caring deeply, and practically for something green and unbothered. People need something to root for, and sometimes, quite literally, they root for ferns dot as the sun dips behind the hedges. Casting long shadows across the competition grounds, you spot one last entry and labeled small, maybe even accidental. It sits slightly off the table, crooked, quiet, a single frond, elegant but modest. You lean in. No plaque, no ribbon, just a folded card with a handwritten note. I grew this while grieving. It helped. No prize needed. You step away from the tent, the music trailing behind you, and feel that familiar quiet unfurling inside, the peace of growth, the stillness of leaves. Somewhere in your coat pocket, a spore rests. Tomorrow, maybe, you'll plant it. It's late evening now, and you're standing in the musty backroom of a little Victorian bookshop, the kind that smells of wood smoke, dust, and barely suppressed judgment. A single gas lamp flickers overhead, casting just enough light to reveal your latest treasure, a shelf devoted entirely to fern literature. That's right. Tonight, we delve into the leaf-strewn pages of books, guides, and fern-fueled passion, projects that once filled the drawing rooms and satchels of pterodomaniacs across the empire. You run your hand along the cracked spines, rustic ferns of Westmoreland, ferns for the windowsill, spiritual growth through Sorry. Okay, that last one might have been satire, but then again, this was Victorian Britain. Mainstream historical fact. Fern literature exploded in popularity during the fern craze, with over 300 titles published between 1840 and 1890. These ranged from serious botanical texts to illustrated gift books, devotional, hybrids, children's fables, and even fern-themed poetry. You slide one book from the shelf, The Ferns of Great Britain and Ireland by Thomas Moore. Heavy, leather-bound, smells like long winters and moral obligation. Inside, the illustrations are hand-colored lithographs, soft washes of green, detailed to the point of obsession. Each fern sits upright, posed like a Victorian debutante, its fronds arranged with delicate composure. The text is, shall we say, thorough. You learn more than you ever wanted to know about the base of the Reikis. You are now uncomfortably aware of the word indusium, and yet it's weirdly comforting. You imagine Mr. Moore hunched over his desk by candlelight, eyes blurry, painstakingly describing every pinner and sub-pinner as if the fate of the empire depended on it. Nearby, a stack of smaller books, popular ferns, the kind designed for ladies' parlours and rainy afternoons. Ferny Comrades is one, the parlour fern book is another. You flip through a copy of Our Woodland Friends and find an entire chapter in which a lonely fern befriends a talkative snail and helps him navigate class anxiety. Charming, deeply questionable, but charming. A quirky tidbit. One bestseller of the time, the fern garden included fashion advice, tips for arranging ferns in one's hat, and a series of moral fables for the fern lover. In one, a boastful polypody loses its color from vanity. In another, a humble spleenwort saves an orphan squirrel. Ferns were not just plants, they were role models. Historians still argue whether fern books were more educational or performative. Some scholars believe they masked domestic boredom with the illusion of scientific purpose. Others argue they provided a rare intellectual outlet for women at a time when formal study was largely off limits. Either way, the result is the same. Shelves upon shelves of gently decaying books, their pages pressed with ferns. Pencil notes in margins, names inscribed in cursive you can barely read. You stumble on one particularly odd volume, Fern Lore and Legend. Inside, alongside actual species information, are myths and superstitions. Ferns that cure melancholy. Ferns that grant invisibility. Ferns that whisper the names of your true love. If picked at midnight during a thunderstorm while wearing linen gloves and thinking only pure thoughts, specific but tempting, you flip to a chapter titled Of Ferns and Fairies. The idea was common in Victorian folk revival, that ferns, being so ancient and secretive, were somehow magical. The fern seed myth was especially popular, the belief That on Midsummer's Eve, fern spores became briefly visible and could be collected to unlock mystical powers. Spoiler, the spores are always there. They're just really, really small. But why ruin the fun? You lean against the back wall, now surrounded by stacks of green-spined books, and imagine someone may be a school teacher, or a bored vicar's daughter curled up beside a fireplace, reading The Fern Lover's Companion while rain taps gently on the WINDOWSILL dot outside. The world demanded so much propriety, appearances, silence. But inside these books, there was wonder, discovery, a sense that even something as small as a curled-up fiddlehead could carry the weight of story. One passage, scribbled in the margin of a second edition copy of Ferns, Their Habits and Homes, reads, saw this. One by the church wall, looked lonely, took it home, thrives beside the piano. And there it is again, that intimacy, that quiet connection between page and place, plant and person. You flip to a final book, Flora Domestica, a household guide from 1823, slightly predating the full pterodomania wave, but already offering rapturous praise for Adianum capillus veneris, the maidenhair fern. The author describes it as a whisper in green, more breath than body. Someone was clearly on their second glass of sherry. When they wrote that, you close the book gently, the lamp flickers again, the cat reappears judging. Always. You offer it a scratch behind the ears, but it vanishes into the stacks. Unimpressed by your newfound botanical knowledge. In this dim little room, time feels soft. The pages don't care about trends. The spores have long since fallen. But the stories remain. So many people, across so many rainy afternoons, sat with these books hoping to understand the ferns around them and maybe themselves. They didn't all get it right. The drawings are occasionally suspect. The Latin is questionable. But the affection, the reverence, that part's unmistakable. You step outside into the misty street, the old shop door creaking shut behind you. Under your arm, one book, Ferns. And you? A bit moldy. Smells like knowledge. You'll read it by candlelight tonight. Just in case. It's evening again, and you're standing at the threshold of a different kind of sanctum, a space once reserved for hushed reverence, amateur speculation, and, occasionally, an accidental frog. You found your way into a Victorian fernery. And not just any fernery, but one of the grand ones. Welcome to the glass cathedral of chlorophyll. It's enormous. Iron-framed glass walls stretch upward, disappearing into a haze of condensation. Every surface is wet to the touch, and the air is dense with the smell of damp earth and soft decay. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of trickling water, a small man-made waterfall echoing gently. The whole place sighs with green. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, wealthy Victorians began constructing elaborate ferneries, indoor or outdoor glasshouses entirely dedicated to the cultivation and display of ferns. Some were modest additions to homes. Others were full-blown architectural marvels, complete with heated floors, artificial fog, and exotic imports that had no business surviving in English weather. And let's be clear, these weren't just fancy gardens. These were status statements. To own a fernery meant you were not only cultured and botanically inclined, it meant you could afford a dedicated space for non-edible greenery. That's a power move. You walk through a curved path flanked by raised stone beds. On your left, a towering tree fern fans out like a Victorian lady's parasol. On your right, smaller fronds tremble slightly as a breeze slips through the vents overhead. The temperature is tropical. Your spectacles fog. A butler in crisp waistcoat appears silently beside you with a towel. For the glasses, sir. He vanishes just as quietly. You wonder if he lives here. Perhaps the ferns do the hiring. A quirky tidbit: in one particularly lavish estate, the owner commissioned a full-time fern attendant whose duties included leaf polishing, morning misting, and reading poetry aloud to sensitive specimens. The man later published a memoir titled Fronds Before Friends. Unclear whether it was satire. Also unclear whether he had friends. Historians still argue whether these grand ferneries were driven by genuine botanical passion, or the Victorian urge to catalogue and control every inch of the natural world. Some call them the greenhouses of empire miniature colonial experiments, filled with plants plucked from tropical locales and forced to adapt to polite British humidity schedules. You reach the centre of the fernery where a marble bench sits beside a shallow pool. Koi glide through it lazily, occasionally inspecting the roots of a hanging asplenium nidus above. A plaque on the wall reads, built in 1864 for Lady Ditherley, who believed ferns promoted moral purity. You're not sure about moral purity, but your skin feels oddly dewy. That must count for something. These ferneries weren't just for quiet admiration either. They were social spaces. Invitations were sent, tea was served. Guests were expected to walk slowly, comment appreciatively, and refrain from picking anything even. If it looks like a weed, Margaret. One guest book from a private fernery includes entries such as, "The tree fern was divine." The sandwiches, less so. Atmospheric. "I believe I saw God in a spleenwort. Regrettably fainted from the heat. Apologize for damaging moss." Even Queen Victoria herself reportedly enjoyed visiting ferneries, though she was famously disapproving of hybrids. Too unpredictable. A fern, she once suggested, should know its place. There's something curiously spiritual about the space, the high ceilings, the filtered light, the hush. You catch yourself tiptoeing as if not to disturb the spores. Someone is tending to a shaded corner with a small brass spritzer and what looks like the botanical equivalent of a surgeon's tray. You nod. They nod. Fern people recognize their own, and yet, despite all the grandeur, you notice something small, a single wild frond poking defiantly from a crack in the stone floor. It wasn't planted, it just grew. A volunteer, a gate crasher. The most Victorian thing in this room, really. You kneel beside it. It's unremarkable, no exotic shape, no dramatic story, but somehow more moving than the sculpted displays nearby. This is what all this was for, wasn't it? Not the glass, the wrought iron, the French tiles, just this, the quiet marvel of something, choosing to grow. You rise and continue on, passing a display labelled specimens of empire. Ferns from India, Jamaica, South Africa, each labelled, catalogued, neatly trimmed. You read the tags with interest, but also a growing awareness of how much was taken renamed. Repotted. It's hard to look at the beauty without seeing the weight of it. Some fronds come with stories. You can't flatten into a Wardian case still. There's no denying the wonder here. You reach the far end of the fernery and look back across the path. Every shape of green, every texture of leaf, the way the air shimmers slightly, heavy with moisture, the way everything feels alive but not rushed, just slowly, confidently. Unfolding. It's hard not to feel smaller in here, and softer, like the ferns have reminded you of something you once knew as a child: how to watch, how to wait, how to stay still long enough for something lovely to happen. And just before you leave, you find a tiny brass sign beside the exit. It reads, "Please return with less haste and more wonder." You nod. You will. It's strange how quickly fear becomes routine. You wake. You check under the bed. You count the bone sheep, still just one, unmoving, tucked on the hearth like a guilty heirloom. You sip your tea, watching the frost climb the window, and wonder if the frost is watching back. You no longer ask questions like, "What was that noise?" or "Why does the dog refuse to look at the rug?" You ask, "How loud was it? How fast is it moving this time?" Progress. Your host has started referring to the fold as the empty. Not the pasture, not the field, just the empty. Like it's a room that has not yet filled or has and emptied itself again. The daughter suggests planting something in it. They wouldn't mind, she says. You will plant barley together that afternoon. It feels more ceremonial than agricultural. That night, the wind comes back. Not hard, not hostile, just present, whispering through the slats, stirring ash in the hearth, plucking gently at the corners of your blanket. You hold still and listen, then, faintly, from the distance, ableat. Soft. Lonely. And wrong. The daughter opens one eye from across the room. That's not ours. She says, simply, you don't reply. You don't need to dot in the morning. There's a new carving on the table. Not hers, a sheep. As usual but twisted, its head upside down, its legs bent inward, its wool carved with tiny circles. No one claims it. The dog won't go near it. You put it in the compost pit with gloved hands. 3 more appear that week. You burn them all. Quietly dot in pieces. That's Sunday. The matron finds tufts of grey fleece inside the flour bin. They smell like moss and salt. The uncle quietly nails a set of horse teeth above the door. When you ask why, he says, to confuse them. Confuse who, you ask? The ones that forgot they're gone. He says, you stop asking after that. The croft falls into a rhythm again, but now the rhythm includes watching the corners, listening for slow breathing where there should be none, rearranging the furniture so no chairs. Face the door after dark. The Kinder not has passed, but something stayed. Not violent, not loud. Just left over. Like scent on a scarf, like breath in a bottle. You dream of sheep again. Only now you're one of them. You walk in line. You graze. You stare with glassy eyes at a croft you used to know, watching yourself through the window as someone else wears your blanket. Historians still argue whether Icelandic dreams carried prophetic weight or were simply vessels for accumulated stress. They debate the symbolism of hooves in the psyche, of wool as a metaphor for memory. They quote Freud, Jung, and sagas in equal measure, but they never woke up bleating. You do. Just once. You never tell anyone. The daughter gives you a new carving the next day, a bird. But this time, its wings are folded around something small, a sheep, sleeping. Inside it. You keep it under your pillow, just in case you forget which you are. The days lengthen. Light returns slowly, first as pale suggestions across the snow, then as full-blown golden defiance. You watch as the shadows shrink, the windows brighten, and the croft fills with the creaks and sighs of thawing wood. But not all shadows leave when the light returns. Some simply wait for longer nights. The barley sprouts, green, hopeful shoots clawing their way through frost-hardened soil. You and the daughter check them each morning like nervous parents. She names them after constellations. You name yours definitely not haunted. It's spring, but only technically. One evening you see something on the ridge, a line of shapes, far in the distance, walking slowly across the horizon. They aren't sheep, they're too still, but they follow the same trail, the one your flock vanished into. You don't mention it. No one would ask, what did you see? They'd ask how many. You lose count at 8. That night, the wind sings again, not whistling through cracks, but humming, like someone breathing into a bottle. You hear it as you drift into sleep, and somewhere in your dream, the hill opens like a mouth, and the flock walks out, all of them, but none of them look at you. You wake with your hand in your pocket, fingers wrapped around the tooth. You never remember putting it there. That morning, the compost pit is opened. The boards shoved aside. Inside, the ashes are gone. In their place, a single stone, smoothed by time and shaped deliberately into a small spiral. The daughter finds you staring at it. She doesn't speak, just presses a wool pouch into your hand and walks away. Inside the pouch, salt, a needle, a sliver of bone carved with one letter you don't recognize. You carry it with you after that. Not out of fear, out of respect, out of memory. The bone sheep remain quiet. No new ones appear, but every so often you find one that's changed, turned slightly, tilting its head, like it's trying to listen better, or waiting for something familiar to return. Historians still argue whether any of this actually happened, whether the sheep were ever haunted, whether the people ever truly believed or just performed belief to make peace with the dark. Some say Iceland's stories are just winter, made personal. Others say that memory has a body, and sometimes it wants to graze. You help with the planting. You mend the fence. You sit with the uncle as he teaches the dog to bark at shadows, not to chase them, just to keep them honest. And at night, you sleep with one eye open, not because you're afraid anymore, because something out there remembers you, And in this land of forgotten flocks and whispering fields, the only thing more dangerous than forgetting is being remembered too well